Whoa. It has been a brutally wet winter here in Sydney this year, which gives us a great opportunity to talk about one of those concerning issues that confronts every cactus growing hobbyist. I'm talking about rot. When our plants go from seemingly healthy one day to a revolting, black, collapsing pile of goo the very next, it's never an enjoyable thing. So today, we're going to have a look at what causes rot, how we can prevent it, and what we should do if we notice it in one of our plants. And I've got a plant that is currently rotting away to use as a bit of an example for you. So let's get into it, and hopefully you'll walk out of this episode a little bit better positioned to deal with the inevitably unhealthy plants that will always pop up in every cactus grower's collection. A little bit earlier in the year, I planted some cacti in the ground. Wanted to see how they'd fare, especially over the course of the year. One of those plants was a species called Trichocereus riosaniensis. Really beautiful South American columnar cacti. What it's got, fascinatingly, are these almost geometric shapes up and down the trunk. They're quite remarkable plants to look at, very, very beautiful. However, my Trichocereus really seemingly has not enjoyed this relentless cold and relentless rain. And I've noticed a few concerning signs that I think point to rot. So let's go get it out of the ground, and what we're going to do is give it a bit of a diagnosis, and if the prognosis isn't good, we might hack it open and see what we can do. So here it is, we've got it out of the ground, and you can see it's got some pretty bad sludgy marks at the top, and down at the bottom, similar story. It's just real mushy, black, dead tissue. The fact that it's at the top and the bottom, I think, is a pretty bad sign. But in a minute, I'm going to hack it open, and we're going to be able to decide whether or not there's any saving this plant, or whether it's going to be a fantastic example on the autopsy table showing you exactly how rot works. But the fact that the rot's at the top and the bottom, I think doesn't speak too well for the chances of this plant's survival. The only way to figure it out is to cut it open though, so in a moment we'll do just that. However, before we do, it's really important to understand why rot happens in cacti. Essentially, these plants are succulents. That means that they're very well adapted to dealing with extended periods of dry, but evolutionarily, they're not all that well suited for the most part to long periods of water, long periods of rain. Their roots, in particular, are suited to sucking up a large amount of water very, very quickly, but then sitting there and resting. And that's why generally the advice is let the soil dry out before you re-water. When they do get exposed to that prolonged moisture, what you'll find is that some of the cells will not be able to uptake it, and they'll collapse. Now that doesn't mean rot straight away, but when you've got collapsed cells, dead cells in a plant, it's essentially an open gateway for pathogens like bacteria and fungus to get inside the plant. Now, unlike your more woody plants like a typical tree, cacti are essentially a big kind of like tube full of water and full of sugars. And as you can imagine, that's like a buffet to a little fungus or a little bacteria, and they can spread rapidly through the plant, resulting in complete death in a very short period of time. And so that's why when we notice rot issues, fungal issues with a plant, it stands to reason that we have to deal with it pretty quickly. But before we do that, let's hack open Trichocereus, perform a bit of a dissection, maybe an autopsy, and we can look at how all of this is going to work, and maybe what we can do to save this plant. I don't know. If you're enjoying today's show and you're learning something, hit the like button. If you're not already, hit subscribe, and maybe check out some of this cool merch, like the Aridzine Cactus Club t-shirt. Every little bit helps support this show grow. Really appreciate it. Anyway, let's get straight back into caring for rotting plants. So as you can see, the base of this plant is looking absolutely filthy. Surprisingly, the roots seem relatively intact. So it tells me that this isn't actually a case of root rot. This is an infection that's got into the plant skin itself. Maybe there's been a little micro wound, maybe a rat took a little nibble on it, maybe something else happened, and that's been the vector for this rot to get into it. But even so, what we're going to do, we're going to start by chopping off the roots just to give me a bit more of an idea of what's going on. So, hack through there. Now I'm surprised, even doing this, how localized the rot seems. Because cutting just below where it is, what you'll find is that the black tissue here, that's the rot. Now I've cut this less than a centimetre below where this whole plant is just a messy, gooey, filthy thing. And you can see there's a bit of surface rot. Now where we need to be really careful is in this inner ring here. That's the vascular tissue. Not to get too technical, but that's essentially the organ that enables the plant to pass water and nutrients up and down the stem. And that's the main way that rot is going to travel up this plant. So you can see there's a little bit of black in there. That tells me that some of this rot has gotten into the vascular tissue in the middle of the plant and potentially started moving up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go hunting. We're going to start chopping this plant up, seeing how far it's progressed along the stem. So what we'll do, get rid of these roots, and I'm just going to pick a point, 2 or 3 centimeters up from where the rot is, and we'll do another cut. And that's going to be fairly indicative of whether this is a dead plant or whether this is a plant potentially worth saving. And if you have a look at that, completely green, healthy, rot-free tissue, which is a surprise. The fact that the rot in this plant was both at the top and the bottom, I'd assumed that it had travelled the full length of the plant and therefore was a goner. My plan today, I was going to hack this whole thing up and show you how that rot travels up the trunk of a plant. We're not going to be doing that today. We're pivoting. We're turning this into a plant rescue because I reckon there's enough plant here that we can actually save. So we discard this filthy rotten bit, and now we're going to repeat the process for the top end of the plant here. As you can see, again, disgusting, rotten, black, gnarly, collapsing tissue there. We need to figure out the extent of the rot and how far it's travelled along the stem. So, again, I'll just pick a point. Oh, I don't really want to touch that. That's disgusting. Pick a point. We'll start about 3 centimeters down from where I can see visible rot, and we'll just go chop, chop, chop. That was pretty easy. And again, fantastically, we've got healthy green tissue, which tells me that what we've got here is a very localized infection, and this middle portion of the plant here is completely healthy. We're going to be able to save it. Might be a bit unseemly, but it's not dead, and that's very exciting. So what do we do to save our healthy tissue? Well, there's a few things. First of all, we're going to keep it dry. I said that any sort of wound as a vector for pathogens to get into. That there and that there, they're very significant wounds. So what we need to do is let this sit in a dry, cool place, hopefully for a couple of weeks, even a month or two. And what that will do, that will let that callus over. That exposed flesh will harden up and kind of turn into a scab. And once it's done that, it'll be ready to plant. But there are a few other things we can do to help it along the way, and I'll show you one of them right now. In here, I've got a product called horticultural sulfur. It's a sulfur powder, and sulfur is a naturally occurring, I suppose, not a fungicide, but it does create a fantastic barrier against fungal infection. And so what I always find it's a worthwhile thing to do is to take your sulfur powder and just liberally coat the cut ends, and then you're going to be really well protected against any reinfection. This now needs to sit down somewhere and dry out for a little while, and then excitingly I'll be able to plant it. Now, full disclosure, this isn't the first Trichocereus that I've had rot on me this winter. Here's one I prepared a little bit earlier, and it's been sitting now, I reckon, for about 2 or 3 weeks, and you can see that callusing effect already starting to occur. When springtime rolls around and temperatures start to rise, this will be very well positioned to go straight into the process of re-rooting. Put in a bit of soil, bit of mineral stuff, withhold water for a little while, gradually increase the moisture, and you'll be seeing new roots from that end and new growth from this end in no time whatsoever. So we don't have to worry because we caught this rot early enough. But I promised you a dissection, and so that's exactly what you're gonna get. I expected I was gonna be chopping up the full length of a plant, but we do have something pretty filthy here, and we're gonna chop it up lengthways and see exactly what's going on under the surface. Wish me luck. This is going to, probably be quite disgusting, especially doing this without gloves. All right. Ugh, yuck. Now, having a look at this rot here, it suddenly stands to reason why this plant hasn't died, because you can see all this infected tissue, but that vascular tissue which runs up the center of the plant might be a little bit hard to see here, but it hasn't yet breached that vascular tissue. If it had, what you would find is that very rapidly you'd see these black marks starting to run vertically along the length of the plant and traveling far beyond where the surface wound is. And that would be when you'd have a real rough go of trying to rehabilitate this plant. But the fact that it's not in that vascular tissue is precisely why we've been able to save it today. Now, let's talk about how we can prevent this from ever happening again. Prevention is always better than a cure, I reckon, when it comes to growing plants. And there are 2 things that we can do to prevent our plants from rotting. The first of those is to give our plants a really gritty, well-draining soil. When I say gritty, I mean it needs to have mineral chunks in it, often between 2, 5, to me even up to 20 millimeters in size. You can see this here is the sort of chunky, gritty mineral soil that I use, and broadly speaking, that does wonders for me. Clearly, not necessarily for plants that are sitting under waves and waves of rain for months on end, but by and large, it does a good job at preventing plant death. The second thing that we can do is to moderate our water. Good beginner advice is always let your soil dry out before you water again. When you get a little bit more experience, you can start tinkering with that a little bit. I usually don't let that happen, but I am using a very gritty soil. But when you think about that, you start to see why in wintertime here, where we have just had months of relentless rain, I've had quite a few plants show signs of rot. It's just inevitable when you don't have the space under cover to keep them out of the weather. I have my most precious plants in here, and the ones that I think can probably endure a bit more, or I'm willing to test them, they spend their winter time and their summertime out exposed to the world. What I've learnt this winter is that Trichocereus is not a plant that wants to spend its winter in the rain. Now, if you do notice fungal issues on your plants, you can start by treating them with a systemic fungicide, something like this one here, which is good for kind of cosmetic level fungus. But if you've got serious rot issues, it's not going to stem the tide. When that happens, you are going to need to resort to surgery. And what you're going to need to do in every instance is ensure you remove every bit of rotten tissue, especially when it gets into that vascular tube up the middle of the plant. You do that, and you stand a very good chance of rescuing your plants before it's too late. But that's why it's always good to keep an eye on your plants pretty closely. Look for changes in health, changes in colour, any little marks on the surface of the plant, which might turn into a bigger issue down the line. Now, I don't want this episode to be all doom and gloom, so I thought I'd finish it up on a positive note. This is a Trichocereus. It's a coloured flowered hybrid. It's called Super Apricot. I've talked about it on the channel before. It has the most incredible flowers when it eventually gets there. Very sadly, I noticed this plant had a bit of rot at the end of its growing season. Performed a bit of surgery, chopped it off on a surprising diagonal. But excitingly, after sitting on a heat mat for the whole extent of this winter, you can see it's shooting out some new roots. It's going to be really well positioned to start growing again over the course of the summertime. And I'll make sure I'm a little bit more careful about how I treat what was a fairly expensive purchase. But that just shows rot isn't a death sentence if you catch it early. It's just one of those things that you need to monitor closely and deal with very quickly if you do suspect that it's happening. It's never fun having to chop your plants up, but it's better that than having them collapse into a pile of sticky goo like we've seen a little bit of today. So that's Aerogene for another week. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I hope you've learned something about keeping your plants healthy. I'll be back again next Monday. Catch you then.